Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's very, very nice to see all of you that were here before. And again, welcome to anybody who's just joining us for the first time. Now, we're in our third and final seminar of this short course on the history of Irish Jewry from more or less, I suppose, medieval times to the present day. My name is Dr. Melanie Brown, as I'm sure most of you will know by now. And as I said, it's a pleasure to be with you. Now, as this is the last session, I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous. So I'd like to thank Alyssa Silva, who reached out to me in the first instance. I'd like to thank her for coordinating this programme. I'd like to thank Maggie Milstein for all of her tech support. And I'd really like to thank the American Jewish University for presenting this programme to you. Now, this evening, I think I will adjust slightly the format of the session tonight. I might leave a little bit more time for questions because I know that people do have questions. I think there's been some excellent questions coming in. People have been sitting on questions, so I might add a little bit more time for that. And during the course of today's session, I will partly be talking about historical matters, but then I will also be talking about the present day lived experience. And I'll be pointing out some things, and I will be making some, making some comments of my own. So I would like to add here that any opinions that I give are my own opinions. I'm not actually a spokesperson for the Jewish community. I'm not a spokesperson for the Irish government. So any observations or opinions that I give are largely based on my own experiences. So just to make that understood. So we left it last week. We were talking, I was intending, obviously, to finish up at 1945. I skated through a few things, and I went on a little bit later than that. I think I had even up until the 60s, possibly, till the 1980s, possibly. And one of the reasons for that is because I realized, I was thinking about this during the week before that, of course, ending any story of European Jewry in 1945, it is going to end badly. And I didn't really want to end the session on a sort of a sour note. So I thought I would skate through some of those things and we will revisit them because, as I said at the very beginning of this program, I will jump forward and backwards a little bit because, the historical narrative is a bit like that because we're talking about people and it's very difficult to impose a timeline on human experience and human endeavour. So I will, as I said, I will jump back and forwards a little bit. So if you will forgive me for that, I hope you will. So we're going to talk a little bit today about Ireland, really during the course of the war. And a little bit before that. So we're talking about an Ireland really from the 1930s onwards. And I think I did mention the fact last week that there is a sort of a perception that all Jews living in Dublin, in the sort of around the canal area, what I explained to you as Portobello or the title Little Jerusalem that is sometimes used. And there seemed to be some perception that everybody suddenly became wealthy and socially mobile and moved out of the city centre and out into the suburbs where, they could have, nice garden for the kids and so forth. And of course, this is nonsense. Obviously some people did, and some people had moved away from that area well before that. And some Jewish people actually never lived in the area because there's also this perception that all Jewish people in Dublin lived around Portobello and they didn't. And some years back, I did a project with my father, who is our civil engineer turned cartographer, and working on a couple of communal lists, lists of postal addresses. And we had one from the mid-30s and one from the late 60s. And we extrapolated the information from these two maps and we applied them onto these two lists, and we applied them onto large maps. And what we discovered was actually at no time did even half of the Jewish population of Dublin actually live around what is known as Little Jerusalem. So certainly less than half of the people in 1935 did. And really the 30s and early 40s were the peak of the Irish Jewish population. I am talking about Ireland and the Jews during the war years, during the late 30s and early 40s.
That's perfect.
Yeah. And I was explaining that there was a particularly anti-Semitic ambassador, Irish ambassador to Germany at the time, a man named Charles Bewley, who was instrumental in advising the Irish government not to take in Jewish refugees. And as a result, they really didn't. They took in a minimal number of people, mostly children. And of those children, well, the majority of them were sent away after the war. They weren't permitted to live here. And, you know, we have other, you know, there have, you know, we see in the minutes of the Doyle that would be our how would you put it, I suppose our parliament. And we see in the minutes of these parliamentary meetings about, you know, essentially what a terrible thing it would be for Jews to enter Ireland, and how, you know, they will destroy the wonderful fabric of society that is Irish society. And I mean, I think I have already explained to you about, you know, the nature of Irish identity and how it became very entwined with Roman Catholicism after 1922, when we became independent from Britain. So there was that aspect to it. There was quite an interesting court case in the late 30s between an Irish Jewish dentist named Dr. Nathaniel Gross, who was trying to renew a lease on a surgery in Circular Road in Portobello, where I explained a lot of the Jews lived at the time. And his landlady was a German lady, and she absolutely wouldn't allow him to renew the lease. He took her to court, and he lost. And the judge said, no, she was absolutely within her rights not to have a Jewish dentist renew his lease, because we didn't want any more Jews in the area. And that judge was a man called George Gavin Duffy, who, again, was very, you know, well known for his anti-Semitic views. And the reason that I'm bringing this up at all, really, is because it just gives us a little bit of context to the current lived experience of Irish Jews, and also the Irish governmental view of Jews, and, you know, the certain amount of double think and double speak and hypocrisy. Now, as I said, you know, these views are my own, but a lot of them would be borne out by fact. And I mean, if you ever wanted to read you know, the Doyle minutes, you know, from that period during the war years, I mean, it makes a very interesting reading if you're looking for aspects of Jews, of the Irish government's attitude to Jews. The other interesting point I think I'd have to make was that during the war years in Ireland, a disproportionate number of Jewish men were imprisoned, you know, for very, very trivial things. But it just seemed that the judges came down particularly heavily on Jewish men. And one of the excuses was, well, you know, while your co-religionists are in such trouble on the continent, you shouldn't be, you know, you shouldn't be in trouble. But you know, so there is this very peculiar false equivalency going on. And again, I'm not making this up. That's the thing. This is not an opinion of mine. This is fact. This is fact. So moving on a little bit from that, I think I did mention to you about a couple of synagogues that had opened, because I did give you a little walking tour of the area last week. So there were a few synagogues that were opened, and one of them was the synagogue that was opened in Rathmines, which is, you know, quite a good way away from Portobello in Dublin terms, because Dublin is a tiny little city, and even if you walk a mile south, well, that's considered, you know, quite a considerable distance. And the first suburban synagogue was really opened at the end of the 1930s. But this was very much in response to the fact that Jewish people no longer felt safe living in Circular Road. Now, I'm not sure that you got my little my comments on my father and myself mapping the Dublin Jewish population, which we did. We mapped the Dublin Jewish population based on a communal postal list from the mid-30s, and we did extrapolate from that, you know, no more than half the population actually lived in this area that's called Little Jerusalem. No more than half ever lived there at any one time, and most of them had really fanned out, you know, further south, along the southern suburbs and along the coast. So again, as I said, this synagogue was very much in response to this. And then we had just after the war, then we found that the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation opened as well. So obviously that was a different practice, a different form of Judaism. And I sometimes get asked, you know, is it the case that there were tensions between the Orthodoxy and between progressive Judaism, like there were in other cities? And particularly, I mean, I would say that at the time in London, this was particularly notable. And the answer is not really, because, you know, the Dublin Jewish population, you know, it is relatively small. I mean, it's really small now, but even back at its peak, you know, there really weren't more than around 4,000. And, you know, realistically, an awful lot of people are either married to each other or related to each other. So you didn't get the same tensions between the Orthodox and the progressive Jews that you might have done in other cities in this part of the world. In case somebody asks that question. Now I'm just trying to think. Of what would be the best place to go, because I mean, I'm conscious that we don't have too much time, and I do want to leave a few more minutes for questions. So what we do find is that so I'm just having a look at some notes here. I've lost a few notes here. So what we found then, you know, as the community migrated south, and, you know, paradoxically, as the community got smaller, so it got imperceptibly smaller, what we did find is we did find a more Jewish institutions, you know, strengthening. Somebody asked last week, you know, really very pertinent and interesting question about whether the Dublin Jewish community, you know, given its small size, whether we had the usual institutions that you would find in most Jewish communities. And I think I answered, well, yes, but there wasn't much time to answer that. So if we move into the 1950s, you know, what for instance, though, although the community is getting smaller by now, you know, what we find is, you know, a huge strengthening, you might say, strengthening of resources. So we're finding that, for instance, in the suburbs, you know, we're finding this you know, very this very important sports club, you know, affiliated to the Maccabi organization, that would have opened in the 1950s, and you know that an awful lot of people were involved in that in the community, and you know, we find that sports is a very important social element of the community, which is, you know, perhaps at some further stage where perhaps it might be interesting to explore, you know, sports and particularly the arts. And I would be particularly interested in the arts because, of course, as I've mentioned before, you know, my particular area is music. And I found that, you know, in the course of a lot of oral history, I've done not just history, but also in terms of the music. And I've collected a great deal of nusach, of historical Dublin nusach from the various synagogues. And for any of you in the audience that doesn't know what nusach is, it would be, you know, a particular repertoire of melodies and songs and modes that would be unique to a community or a congregation. Well, what I found was in collecting a lot of these, because I've recorded them and notated them, you know, this is very much where you have the first-hand descriptions of people's lived experiences, you know, not necessarily through the oral history, but sometimes through the musical history. And I did get quite an interesting, again, just to jump back for a minute to the 30s. And, you know, as I said, you know, that we had this upsurge in anti-Semitism here, that there was a particular gentleman, he was a solicitor here, an attorney. And when he was young, he described to me, he was walking along the canal, the Grand Canal that I've told you about around Portobello. And this fellow came up to him and said, "You're a dirty Jew." And this gentleman, who was, I have to say, quite belligerent, said, "You're a dirty bastard." And you know, this aggressor, he ran away. But this is far, unfortunately, from a unique type of interaction at the time. You know, I've heard people being put off the buses. I've heard people, children being jeered at the streets and told that Hitler was coming for you. And this is all happening during the 30s and the 40s. So again, I can't stress enough that any narrative that says, well, everybody just became socially mobile and moved out to the suburbs because they were wealthy, this is just nonsense. That's just absolute nonsense. So I hope I make that very clear. So we were talking a little bit about Maccabi, and I'm just going to find some nice pictures, because I did show you, I think, some pictures before, didn't I? So here's the synagogue I told you about that was established in 1937 in a red brick house, because I think we're quite comfortable with the idea of the adaptive reuse of space. This is actually now a parish centre for the local Catholic Church, so it's nice to think that there is some sort of ecclesiastical function. And this is the Dublin Jewish Progressive Congregation. So we see that, it's really quite a different, it's really structured in quite a different way, with the BIM in a different place. We've got, we've got a cheder upstairs. There's the synagogue itself there. And I think I showed you Terenure Synagogue. So Terenure Synagogue was established in 1953. A month after it opened, it was burned down. It was an anti-Semitic act of arson, and the insurance permitted it to be rebuilt. And we see the very nice windows there. And that was you might say, the second iteration of the synagogue. Now, you're very lucky to see this, in fact, because we are currently in the process of selling this synagogue, and we are moving to a much smaller site, about sort of 500 yards or so down the road. So that is Terenure Synagogue. And if we move down a little bit next, so here's Dublin Maccabi. Carlisle Cricket Club is its other name, and that's because one of the very first ever sports clubs, Jewish sports clubs in the British Isles, I think the very first one, in fact, was here in Dublin. And it was established by a group of lads in a street around where I'm describing, in a street called Carlisle Street, and they called themselves the Carlisle Cricket Club. So this is the Maccabi grounds, and again, the Maccabi institution, it still exists, but in a different way, because the grounds were sold a number of years ago, and now the Maccabi Association here, it disperses funds to various artistic and sporting endeavours. So that's their function at the moment, and that's the very first committee that they had there. So all the names that, of course, are familiar to me, but obviously won't be for many of you. So if we go on to the next one now, and I may have showed this to you last week, and this was, one of the things that we did in Maccabi in the 1980s, and I think that's where I finished, because it's a very joyous picture, and I wanted to finish on, on a very joyous note. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon, really, is that the history of Jewish Dublin, there's a lot of interest in the history of Jewish Dublin in Dublin. And I give quite a number of these talks. And I was also contracted in Trinity for quite a number of years. I was lecturing in Trinity College Dublin, and I was teaching a course on Irish and Jewish identity. So a lot of it had to do with Irish Jewish history, and also, a lot to do with, how minorities negotiate their own identities within, effectively a monoculture, because Ireland still is more or less a monoculture. And also, we tracked, well, how did Irish people get on abroad, because there was, a colossal amount of Irish emigration, obviously. And we also, we discussed a lot about, well, what does identity mean? And I think the conclusion that we had was, well, what we think of ourselves, how we believe that we present ourselves, actually has got nothing to do whatsoever with the way people perceive us. And I think that we did prove that quite a number of times during the course of the 5 years or so that I taught this course. And the course was extremely popular, and it was very abruptly terminated by Trinity. They said, well, essentially, we don't want it anymore. And I wasn't given any reason for that. And, unfortunately, I'm afraid I reached some conclusions of my own about Trinity and the relationship between Trinity and this particular course that I was teaching. But, that's my personal opinion. And in any case, in some ways, I'm glad to be liberated from it. But the reason that I say this at all is because there's one of the reasons there's such an interest, I think, in Irish Jewry over here is that, you know, a lot of people perceive it, it's a story that ended well. So in comparison with other European Jewish communities, you know, essentially, you know, the Irish Jewish experience was quite good. And, you know, we for instance, that there was very little, we lost very few people in the Holocaust, you know, and the sort of outspoken iteration, you know, outspoken versions of anti-Semitism, we didn't have so many of them. So essentially, Irish people were very comfortable with the idea that, well, you know, we have this small community, it's getting smaller, but actually everything's okay because the story ended well. And the trouble is, you know, nowadays, I'm afraid it is certainly my belief, and it is the belief of others, that the story may well have ended because, you know, we have reached a critically small numbers now. But I don't believe that the story is going to end very well at all because of the rise in, you know, really strange rise in anti-Semitism that has happened so very quickly, and that has some sort of motivations from all different sides, you know, from the left and from the right, and, you know, from all directions, really. So that's quite disturbing. And that's why, you know, looking at this picture here, it was taken in the 1980s when the community was still, you know, quite viable. It was still a lot bigger than it was now. But of course, of those faces there, I would say there's, you know, probably no more than 10, and probably fewer than 10 of those people could still be here. And that's just a fact of life. So let us crack on for a minute. So we're going to go on to the next slide. So this is Maxiki Hadass Synagogue, and it was established in 1968 at the back of a little house behind, you know, along Terranure, which is the village that I'm in now. So if I go out of this house and I walk not even half a mile down the road, this is where we get to. And you might remember right at the beginning of last week, really, I told you about St. Kevin's Parade Synagogue, which was the first synagogue to be established around Portobello. And when that closed in the late 60s, because I'm not sure that I explained to you, all of those smaller synagogues closed. They were all closed by the late 60s or the early 70s, as the congregations died or they moved away. And they just simply consolidated with the larger synagogues that still existed. That would be Adelaide Road, which I told you about, Terranure, and even Greenville Hall, but of course that closed in the early 80s as well. But this was a Maxiki Hadass, a very small congregation, very, very warm and welcoming congregation. This is actually the area where our synagogue is moving to. Now they've taken all of this building down. It was a bit scruffy, to be honest, a bit neglected. So this is all taken down and replaced. But of course, it'll be a much smaller space to accommodate, obviously, a much smaller congregation. So moving on a little bit, I'm going to just show you. These are just a few odd things that you'll see around, or you used to be able to see around Dublin. So here's a plaque that marking Isaac Herzog. I mean, we talked about Isaac Herzog a little bit last week. Of course, he went on to be the chief rabbi of the state of Israel. And there's a plaque. This is the house where the chief rabbi lived at the time. There's just Shalom written on a gatepost. There's a plaque to Leopold Bloom, and we talked about Bloom and Bloomsday a little bit last week, because as I explained, you can't really have a discussion about Dublin Jews particularly, and not talk about Leopold Bloom. Here's a mezuzah on a door. You see this from time to time. Harry Kernoff was a very famous Jewish artist. Here's some bizarre Hebrew graffiti. Now, this was taken quite a long time ago. The graffiti is gone now. And this was a stationery shop where they used to sell Jewish, you know, cards, which is a real rarity over here. It really is. I mean, I can't tell you how unusual it is to walk into an Irish stationery shop and actually find Jewish greetings cards. So that's why I took a picture of it. So it's just a very strange thing. But, you know, these were really at a time, I think, when there was no fear, really. There's no fear of Jewish symbols in the built environment. Excuse me for one moment. But if we move on to something a little bit more contemporary. So this is Trinity College, my alma mater. This is where I studied, and it's where I taught. It's where both my parents studied. It's where a lot of my aunts and uncles studied. It's where my sister and brother studied. And this was occupied by, more or less by the Students' Union. And in a very, very aggressive way, this was made into a stronghold of Palestinian support. And in the course of this support for Palestine, it became, virulently not just anti-Israeli, but also anti-Semitic. And I mean, as I used to try and explain to my students, you can be pro one thing and not necessarily anti the other. But unfortunately, this bit of advice is certainly lost. And what, difficulty that we have in Ireland at the moment is this absolute refusal to unpick, to differentiate the difference between the condition of being Jewish and the state of Israel, because it appears that according to certainly our Irish government and our mainstream media, and certainly a lot of our social media, that there's no difference, that if you're Jewish, then therefore you are affiliated to Israel, you're not fully Irish, and essentially you are bad. And, this was it made Trinity and also all the other universities, but I just mentioned Trinity because it's such an icon. It's such it's such an iconic part of the city centre. And so this was this was, the, if I may use the word again, the iconic front arch. And the whole of the front of college was decorated with these flags. And there were marches and there was chanting and it was very, very aggressive and hostile. There was an awful lot of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli graffiti, I mean, all over this area of Dublin. And, I work, the area where I work in the Royal Irish Academy of Music, that's actually behind Trinity. So, I would have to pass this on the bus every day. And, it is extremely disturbing. I will tell you that it is extremely disturbing to have to see this. So this is inside Trinity. This is the front square of Trinity College, last summer, and you can see, the crowds and crowds, you can see the flags, and you can see essentially how hostile an environment this would be for any Jewish student or any Jewish member of staff. And at the time I was let go, I wasn't one bit pleased about it, but I'm very, very glad that I wasn't working in Trinity last year, because I just think it would have been an absolutely intolerable place to work, particularly when, one is trying to explain Jewish history and Jewish identity, because the fact is I have been engaged with interfaith dialogue for many, many years, but I realized, really in the last year, I realized there's no point in trying to dialogue with people who won't listen to you. There's no point in wasting your breath. There is a point at which you just have to say, yeah, this particular battle is lost. I can't win this. I can't make people listen if they really, really don't listen. If they really, really don't listen or don't want to. And this is unfortunately the case in Ireland at the moment. I mean, I attended a meeting in the door, with a government minister a couple of years ago, along with some members of the Jewish Representative Council. I'm not a member of the Jewish Representative Council, but I was co-opted into this meeting with this particular politician, and we discussed the topic of anti-Semitism, which was already sort of emergent even before October 7th. And all he would do would take the subject back to Israel and back to the Palestinian problem. And it didn't matter how many times we pointed out, we are talking about discrimination, towards Irish citizens by Irish citizens. But he just didn't want to hear that. All he was interested in was, all we can talk about is Israel and Palestinians. And he actually wasn't interested in the issue of Jewish citizens, of Irish Jewish citizens. He just wasn't interested. And unfortunately, this is fairly consistent with our current government. So let's move on a little bit more to another iconic place in Dublin. Here is the Halfpenny Bridge. So again, if you look through the sort of tourist places in Dublin to visit, you'll certainly see the Halfpenny Bridge. It's a footbridge that spans the River Liffey, which I have to tell you isn't a very wide. It's not a very wide bridge. It's it really isn't. But this footbridge is very ancient. And again, you know, this was taken over by this group. I wouldn't have liked the job of crossing it myself, but you mean you again you see how very intimidating this is, and it got an awful lot of media coverage and a lot of media support. And again, you know, you see that it's the Irish flag, the Irish national flag. So, you know, it's this beacon of Irish nationalism is being waved around, you know, alongside the symbol of Palestine. And I'll just show you one more, just because I can. So this is a message that I got a couple of months ago, and I was actually in hospital, you know, from an officer of our chief rabbi. We recently appointed a new chief rabbi, a wonderful young chief rabbi, Rabbi Yoni Reeder, a really terrific guy, you know, very a very suitable appointment. But I got this message from Mrs. Tillman. I can just read it. A 23-year-old Jewish man got the absolute snot. Now, if she's American, if she were Irish, she wouldn't have used the word snot, believe me, because you know, we're a rude bunch here, I'm afraid to say, a scatological bunch. Had the snot kicked out of him this past Friday in Flannery's in Camden Street. It's a pub, we have a lot of them in Dublin. He was wearing hostage merch, yellow bracelet, dog tags. Two Irish and a Middle Easterner cornered him in the gents and asked the last question one should say yes to in a situation like that: are you Jewish? And this didn't make the news. It just, nobody cared, essentially. And, you know, I have to say, this is not the Dublin I grew up in. It's not the Trinity College that I attended. Everything is inverted. Everything is changed. So let's stop all this. Let's not look at any of this anymore. So we're going to stop all that. And we're back to me again. Now, so I'm going to stop talking in a few minutes, I think, to allow a few more questions, because I was aware last week that there were quite a few questions came in, and I just wasn't in a position to answer all of them because of the constraints of time.
I can ask you some questions.
Sure.
So, excuse me.
Of course.
Recently, according to the media, there's been has been an increase of anti-Semitism of not just Irish people, but of the Irish government. You've touched on this a little bit, but can you talk more about how the Irish government is dealing with this influx of anti-Semitism? And do you feel that it's because it never really went away, or do you feel it's the influence of like modern actors or agent provocateurs?
Well, I'll tell you what I think. So as I said before, this is my opinion, you know, based on what I've observed and based on what I've experienced. But, you know, my opinion is it never went away. My opinion is that a lot of it is religious based. And when you ask about, you know, what did the government do about this resurgence of anti-Semitism? Well, the answer is absolutely nothing. And if anything, they found the flames of it even more. They certainly did nothing to discourage it. There's been no prosecutions. There's been nothing like that. And you know, we are, unfortunately, it would seem that we're very helpless. I mean, there are organizations that we can report to, but we find that, well, there's very little point, because they'll gather the statistics, but there's not much will happen. Or, you know, you talk to these people and they wring their hands and they say, oh, well, anti-Semitism is terrible and we must do something about it. But, you know, it's much easier to do nothing than to do something. And that's what we're finding, is that really nothing is being done to help. Now, I would have to say, in fairness, not all Irish people are anti-Semitic. And it would be, you know, very unfair of me to say that the whole Irish population and all Irish Catholics in particular are anti-Semitic. They really aren't. And I mean, I can give you examples of, you know, where I'm sitting now. You know, my parents' neighbour, who's a very elderly lady, she actually patrols the synagogue around the corner every Shabbos morning, because she thinks it's her duty to do so. And I know of another lady around the corner who does the same for the little Jewish school. She does exactly the same thing. She will patrol because she feels it as her bounden duty as an Irish citizen. I mean, I don't know what these very kind ladies think that they can do, but, you know, it does show you know, a very openness and a generosity of spirit. And I think a lot of people feel like that. I mean, I've overheard, you know, a woman in Marks and Spencer's looking to say, I want to buy those Israeli potatoes because they come from the Holy Land. So again, I don't want to say that the whole of Ireland is rabidly anti-Semitic, but I would have to say that some of it certainly is, and the government is not helping. I hope that that in some way goes to answer your question. I hope so.
This one's a little bit longer. But during the 1970s, the IRA reached out to the hardcore Marxist groups in Europe, such as the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, and various Arab terrorist groups. Some IRA fighters trained in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. Gaddafi sent a ship of arms to Ireland, which the British intercepted. Why does the IRA ally with these terrorist groups? And then why is Ireland so virulently anti-Israel today?
Well, I mean, I think back in the 70s, a lot of it came down to economics. But very simply, we were exporting an awful lot of beef to, you know, the Middle East and, you know, to large Arab countries in the Middle East. So, you know, it seemed better, you know, essentially it was better for economic reasons to say, well, you know, we don't like Israel because, you know, essentially the markets in these larger countries were better. So, you know, so it's as simple as that back in the 1970s. I mean, subsequently, it's much more complex. I'm not sure that I'm entirely qualified, you know, to give an opinion on this. But I think, I mean, part of this is certainly to do with Irish nationalism and the alignment with Catholicism, and that, you know, certainly on the island of Ireland, that it's sort of inevitable, it's sort of axiomatic that the IRA in particular would single out Jewish communities because, as you know, according to their model, you might say, of Irish citizenship, you know, Jews just don't fit into that model. And, you know, as to why they should be aligned with other terrorist groups, well, you know, again, I just wouldn't really like to say that. I would just be at risk of offending too many people, and it might be just better if I kept out of that. I mean, you know, I think we all have very strong personal opinions about these things. I certainly do. I remember I grew up during the Troubles. And, you know, that's certainly, I mean, if you don't know what that means, you know, there was an awful lot of IRA activity in the south of Ireland and also in mainland Britain. And, you know, it wasn't always a very comfortable place to live because, you know, we had, you know, a lot of terrorist activity here. And because I was educated in a Protestant school, and most of my social life, even now, you know, would tend to be centered around the Protestant community. You know, this does inform your views, that there's no question about it. I mean, my maths teacher's brother was shot dead by the IRA in the north of mistaken identity, but it doesn't take away from the fact that this innocent Protestant man was shot dead by the IRA. You know, that's something that you live with. But as to why the IRA would align themselves with the terrorist groups, I mean, I think, you know, we can all find reasons for that. As I said, I would not like to commit myself too far. Maybe that's the cowardly answer, but I have to live here.
Are are things different in Northern Ireland? And are there any alliances between the Protestants and the Jews?
I would have said in the past, certainly yes. I mean, you know, the Jewish community in the north, it's really extraordinarily autonomous. I mean, it's really admirable in the way they maintain their autonomy because they're not under the auspices of our chief rabbi, they're under the auspices of the chief rabbi of Great Britain, etc. But by virtue of the fact that they're stuck on an island like we are, you know, I think that they do manage their own affairs to some extent. Now, certainly say in my grandmother's day, there was significant alignment between the Belfast Protestant community and the Jews. And I mean, you know, my grandmother considered herself a northern woman, a northern Protestant woman, and a northern Protestant Jewish woman, because one of the things that comes up a lot is is it the case that is it true that you have Irish, that you have Protestant Jews and Catholic Jews? I would have to say categorically yes. You cannot get away from this. You absolutely do. And I don't know, I don't remember if I said this before, but if I didn't, it's absolutely the truth. And certainly the vast majority of Jews in the south would probably be categorized as Protestant Jews. In the north, certainly in previous generations, yes, I would have said they would be. I couldn't say for certain nowadays because I have very few ties with the Jewish community in the north. So I couldn't categorically say that now. But in the past, yes, I would be reasonably confident that they were.
When an anti-Semitic event happens in Ireland, like the one you mentioned about the young man who had the quote unquote snot beaten out of him, do the police investigate? Are there ever charges brought? How do they deal with this?
It just depends. I mean, I remember a number of years ago, I used to be involved with the Irish Jewish Museum here, one of our communal institutions. And I remember one year just before Rosh Hashanah, somebody planted an explosive in the post box, and the post box was blown up. Now, as it happens, the chairman of the museum at the time was a attorney, a lawyer with a great many how would you, what's the best way of putting it? A lot of contacts, let's just say political contacts. And they found the guys that did it, and they could be sitting in Mountjoy jail even now for all I know. Certainly, there was a lot of fallout from that. But that's because you might say they picked on the wrong people. But in the case of, say, that boy that was beaten up, there was no report in the newspaper. I'm not aware that there was any police follow-up to it. And it just depends. You see, a lot of the time, and this isn't, I think, just unique to Ireland, but there is a lot of underreporting. So there would be other incidents, but again, people think, well, there's no point in reporting. Nobody's going to do anything. Nobody cares. And whether or not that's the truth, and again, I wouldn't like to commit myself, but it just means that a lot of the time things are not reported, and of course, if they're not reported, then nothing proactive can happen about it. So it's all very unsatisfactory, but that is the environment in which we live at the moment.
We're going to move into the light a little bit, and ask an unrelated question.
Good.
Do Irish Jews have a very strong distinction between denominations, like Orthodox and Progressive?
And less so now. I mean, I think some time ago, certainly when I was growing up, yeah, there would have been more so. And my mother said that in her day, very few Orthodox people would have attended the Progressive Synagogue. Nowadays, as I said, it's the case that most of us are either married to each other or related to each other, so those differentiations just don't exist. And then I showed you the picture of the Maxiki Hadass synagogue. Now, when I was growing up, that was considered a really, really religious synagogue for the most religious Orthodox people that lived here. So I mean, though I was brought up, I have to say, pretty Orthodox myself, my family would never have gone there. It would have been perceived that we just wouldn't have fitted in there. And when I first visited there about 15 years ago, I was very surprised that wasn't the case at all, that it was in fact quite relaxed in all sorts of ways I didn't expect. So yeah, again, in the past when there were more of us, yes, there were greater distinctions. Nowadays, not so much at all. I mean, in the past, the progressive congregation, they weren't even invited to sit on the Jewish Representative Council, which is a terrible thing, which nowadays they are included. But yes, there were definitely differentiations made, and certainly not to the benefit of the progressive congregation, certainly. But things change. There's very few of us now, and there is more solidarity between us.
If someone wanted to join a Jewish community in Ireland, especially maybe like an expat or someone who's moving to Ireland,
Yeah.
what would that be like? Especially since you mentioned that everyone has like by blood or marriage. How can people kind of like get into that community if they're outsiders?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I mean, some people manage better than others, and I think it has very much to do. Well, it has very much to do with tolerance on both sides. But I certainly, observing it over the years, and I've observed lots of people. Um, some people just integrate really, really well. Like, Mrs. Tillman, that I showed you that WhatsApp message from. I mean, Mrs. Tillman's been here a few years, and with her husband and her 4 sons. And again, they really worked. You might say they really worked hard at integrating. And with the result is that they really are very well integrated within the community. Um, I've seen others who, perhaps weren't anxious to work so hard. We have quite a lot of Israeli expats living here. And again, it's the same thing. I mean, sometimes, and I mean, I'm sure it's not a good thing, but, there is quite a lot of insularity in a small community on an island like ours. And, there's a certain degree of resentment, I do think, when strangers come in. But if people show that they're willing to participate and that they're willing to participate in communal institutions and communal functions and things, then you find that people will be accepted quite well. But if it's people who just hang around on the fringes, or you might see them once a year at a Hanukkah party, that obviously that's not easy for any of us. So I suppose the answer is we all have to work a bit hard at it, but it is certainly possible, and I mean, we're certainly used, for instance, to most of our clergy over the years, have not been Irish. And that's never been a problem at all. Quite the opposite.
Especially because a lot of people are now being offered to apply for EU citizenship if they're
Yeah.
descendants of Holocaust survivors. So
Mm.
this might become a lot more relevant. But let's talk more about the decreasing Jewish population. Where are they going?
England mostly. Primarily they go to England, they go to London, or even more so, they go to the north of England. And one of the reasons for that, I think I did explain to you again last week, that quite a lot of our modern community that's left would be descended from, Latvians and Lithuanians, and, again, people from the Baltic regions. Whereas in London, you find that quite a lot of the community would be descended from Germans. And, culturally, there are, quite significant differences. And we found over the years that the Dublin Jews tended to integrate a little bit better into those north of England communities. So a lot of them will go to Manchester. What we find is, say, a lot of the kids will go off to university in the north of England, and then they'll settle there. So I mean, the most of them will go to England. Some of them will make Aliyah. Some of them will go to America, but most of them will go to England. And then what happens is, the parents will follow in a few years, and then the whole family is gone. Then, that's one of the driving forces, I think, behind the diminution now of our Jewish population.
Have you ever personally felt the sting of anti-Semitism? As in, has it ever directly affected you in a way that was beyond seeing, protests or whatnot?
Well, certainly in Trinity, the termination of my course was certainly a very anti-Semitic gesture. No question about that. And the way the human resources treated it afterwards, this was not funny. And again, I had no recourse because, essentially it was the college authorities that had ordained this. So yeah, I would say that certainly. I certainly did. And like there've been other sort of little jabs over the years. You find sort of applying for jobs, for instance. I mean, I've always worked in the sector of education, but over here, as I think I explained to you before, education is over here, it's still deeply religious. It's still essentially religious based. It's and most schools, and to an extent universities, are denominational. And if you don't fit in, particularly with schools, then there's no way of getting employment there. So yeah, I mean, you do see this. I mean, I remember applying for a fellowship in one of our smaller universities here years ago, and I mean, all they really wanted to know, they weren't interested in my research, particularly when I was at the interview. They wanted to know what school I went to. And in Ireland, that's a very subtle way of saying, what religion are you? Because it's quite obvious from the school that you went to what religion you were. And then, when you have to explain, I'm not even Protestant, well, this was quite challenging to them. So yeah, I mean, you do see this, but certainly I wasn't impressed with Trinity, but now you see Trinity in all its fabulous colours recently. So it's perhaps not that surprising.
Are there any notable members of the Irish government, either big or small, that are Jewish?
We have had in the past.
And yeah,
We've had a number of Jewish government ministers. We had Mervyn Taylor, who was a Minister for Justice. We had Alan Shatter, who was also a government minister. And Alan Shatter he was a terrible victim of anti-Semitism. I mean, they really drummed him out of the Parliament. And the amount of bad press that he had, and there was a particularly nasty case about, there was a scandal within our police force, and he was, involved with the whistleblowers, and there were all sorts of terrible accusations thrown at him. And when it was discovered, he was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, there was never any apology. And he continues to get very, very bad press in the Irish media. And he just stepped away from Irish politics because he couldn't fight that anymore. So yeah, I mean, we have had Jewish people in the Irish government. I think I mentioned the Briscoes last week as well. So yes, we have in the past, but not at the moment. I'd be extremely surprised to see that in
I
the
think that you're
future. Who knows?
frozen a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It'll unfreeze.
It
But
will.
we can still hear you.
Okay, good.
There you go. You're good.
Excellent.
Is there a Chabad in Ireland?
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Chabad?
There is, yeah, Rabbi Lent. So he was our synagogue rabbi for a while, but now he's separate. And there is a separate Chabad house now. And they actually run a shop and a restaurant, and they're going to be opening up a student residence, I believe, quite soon. So yes, there is Chabad in Ireland, yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to move again into the light. Are there any distinctly Irish Jewish foods, special recipes for the holidays or Shabbat that are unique to Ireland? I imagine there's a lot of cabbage involved, or particularly an Irish spin to a Jewish meal.
Sure, because I mean, I think that we are essentially very, very Lithuanian and Latvian. I'm not sure that there's any particular Irish. I mean, look, there are a lot of potatoes, but then, that's a very Russian thing anyway. Like the folk song about, Monday bulbous, Tuesday bulbous, all that sort of thing. I do remember a funny incident when we had an American chief rabbi years ago, back in the 90s, and he invited a number of us around, and they weren't long here, he and his wife, and they invited a number of us here, and they had served potato latkes, and they had applesauce, and they had a chrein. The applesauce, of course, is sweet, and the chrein, for anybody here who doesn't know, it's a really sinus clearing relish made of horseradish and red cabbage that makes your eyes water. But in Ireland now, we would never eat applesauce with latkes. I mean, it's just an unheard of thing. And the rabbi and his wife were absolutely appalled when we all dived into the chrein and we watched them eating the latkes with the sweet sauce, and we all thought to each other, you're mad. This is just madness. So, I mean, that's one difference that I can think of, but I'm not sure there's any specific Irish Jewish recipes. But of course, everybody's mother and grandmother, I mean, it's always specific to them, and it's always their food is better than everybody else's, and it's different. I mean, certainly over here, there was culturally, there was always a lot of dislike of the food of the Polish Jews over here, because we had a few Polish families of Polish extraction. And I remember, there were a lot of complaints. I mean, when I was a child now, there were complaints about, okay, well, that chopped herring, I mean, that's Polak and it's way too sweet. We Litvaks, we don't eat it like that. So we used to get a bit of that as well. But I think that that's not Irish. I think, this is delving into maybe further back in time. So maybe that gives you a little bit of insight. But I wouldn't have said there was any particularly Irish Jewish recipe, really.
Last question. How do you think the situation of anti-Semitism in Ireland can be fixed or at least quelled?
Well, if you want my honest opinion, if you want me to be absolutely honest, I would say that the battle against anti-Semitism is lost and it cannot be won. That's my honest opinion. But if I were towing a more diplomatic line, I would say that, well, it will just take a lot of dialogue between various parties, and we will have to make the majority culture actually see, well, this is what it feels like, this is what it is like when you're in a small ethnic community and you feel under threat from all sides. I think that that's what will have to happen, but I'm not confident that this is going to happen or that it can. But as I said before, these are my opinions and I can't speak for everybody, but this is what I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melanie Brown. Do you have a few last words for our program?
No, as I said, I'm just so grateful that you gave me this platform and this opportunity to talk about Irish Jewry, to a wider audience. So I'm very, very grateful to that. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I'm sorry I lost the tech a little bit earlier on. My apologies for that, but I'm only human. But thank you so much for joining in. I do appreciate it. I appreciate all the people that got in touch and do continue to get in touch, because I love to hear from you. So thank you all very, very much indeed.